Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 149th episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this episode, I'll be commenting a video just published on the channel Theories of Everything by Kurt Chamungel. Really interesting video, as usual. Love those videos. This is a talk between Bernardo Kastrup and Susan Blackmore, Idealism versus Illusionism. And so I'll just, touch on a few points that I wrote down as I was listening to the video. And of course, the link is going to be in the description. So the first thing is they love bashing materialism. They're like, yeah, it doesn't make sense, materialism, this and that. And then Kurt at the end even asks, like, what would it take for you to believe in materialism? So let me just tease you a little bit and make you understand that we don't care whether materialism is true or not. What is important is to understand that when humans believe something is true, they act as if it were true, and that generates physical, tangible results and actions. That is, regardless of whether materialism is true, the fact that people believed it was true led humanity down the road of developing technologies, cars, and all kinds of systems that are based on a materialist kind of view or worldview. So imagine if in the 16th century, instead of doing this battle against religion based on a false, quote-unquote, belief of materialism, people directly switched to idealism and just said, well, actually, it's just all mind. Everything is mind. Well, with that kind of belief, the actions assorted to that kind of belief would not have led humanity to imagine technology. Because at that point, it's not a kind of worldview that leads to that sort of action or that sort of interaction with reality. And so I'll give you an example. Imagine if you are an advanced kind of being and you know there's going to be a flood in a certain area. But the village there and the people there have these weird beliefs and superstitions and spirits of nature or whatever. And you're like, all right, well, you can't explain it to them in materialist kind of terms that you say, well, I've predicted the weather patterns and I've had all this mapped out and there's going to be, a lot of rainfall and this is how the water cycle goes and blah, 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 because their minds are just not ready to accept that kind of explanation. So you come to them and say, the spirits of the forest have talked to me. There is the necessity to now dig a huge ditch in front of the village and put a barrier or construct a dam or something. And so the villagers then get to work, do the work. The flood comes, they're protected, they're very happy, and they still believe in their delusionary kind of thing of, oh, thank God the spirit of the forest saved us. But it doesn't really matter whether their belief was true or not, so long as it led to the right action and the right consequence, So just imagine that materialism, imagine that basically humanity is in that kind of state where, there is a kind of higher intelligence that's thinking, okay, how can I get these idiots from point A to point B to develop in a certain way, which is, makes sense, whatever. They need to go through materialism because that is something that is going to make them act in a certain way, which is exactly what we expect. And so in that sense, what is true from what is not true in terms of the underlying reality is less important than the actions that you take on what you believe is true and whether those actions are aligned with some kind of higher purpose or meaning. And that kind of joins, I think, Jordan Peterson's point when he debated Sam Harris when they were talking about the truth, is that if the truth leads you down an evolutionary dead end, then who cares? Like imagine if you snap the finger, everybody suddenly believes in illusionism or idealism or whatever other kind of belief system, and people take it for true, but then their minds or their kind of level of consciousness is not prepared for this, and they say, oh, if it all is mind and I'm an illusionary self, I'm just going to kill myself. Why should I suffer? And then the entire humanity just commits suicide simultaneously, and that's the end of that. Well, is that good? Is that bad? I mean, who's to tell, obviously. But still, from the perspective of the physical self, of your subjective experience as a human, we've been programmed to fear death, to not seek those kinds of experiences. So you could say that that's not what is kind of expected of us. Otherwise, why would we be programmed with fear of death and trying to protect this body or the integrity of this body? So it's and I'm not saying that that's what would have happened. I'm just saying it's like a thought experiment to think about. It's to stop thinking that this obsession with trying to disprove something or prove something else, that's not what's so important. It may be a little bit important, but more important is the global picture of what you do with that truth, how people react to that truth, what they do, and maybe several kinds of different truths will lead to different actions, which combined are even better than trying to impose one thing on everyone. And so in that sense, it may not even make sense to debate, I guess. So even what I'm saying right now maybe just doesn't necessarily isn't necessarily important. Maybe this video is only meant to be seen by a few people, and the ones that specifically need to hear this, and not other people. And this goes completely against this kind of perception or belief that the truth is somehow important and needs to reach everyone's ears. I always give this example of, like, imagine you're like in the 15th century and people are still under the spell of monotheism, and then there's this one guy that realizes the materialist kind of mindset, and he goes in the middle of the town square and goes, "Guys, don't you realize? I mean, everything is physical. It's all cause and effect. And we're a tiny little ball made of tiny little balls and specks of matter. And it's all just like everything that I'm saying has already been pre-programmed in my mind because just chemical reactions. And so I'm not even in control. I mean, there's no free will. And, mostly we're all void. I mean, in here it's just empty and it's 99%. I'm just vapor. I don't even exist really. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, people would be like, okay, let's burn that motherfucker. He's completely gone mad. And then, comes along another guy that minds his own business, just does experiments in his lab, based on empiricism, and manages to improve his, well-being, his material well-being by developing all these kind of systems and whatever. His house is cleaner. He's less ill because he manages his body hygiene, because he has this materialist mindset where there are bacteria and needs to take care of the cleanliness of his body, of his house. Plus, he invents all kinds of things, like this new kind of way of creating light, or new means of transportation, whatever. And people think like, wow, this guy. Well, first of all, he isn't scared of the priests and all this apocalyptic kind of discourse anymore. He's living his life, and he looks like he's really balanced and happy and whatnot. Hey, I want that. And so that's fundamentally much more important than objectively kind of speaking what the truth is. It's, can you handle the truth as a human being, and can your state of being be such that you attract people, that they feel attracted to what you kind of emit as a kind of a way of interacting with reality, of a state of being with that kind of truth. Like, you take on that truth, like whether it's illusionism or idealism or panpsychism or whatever, and then your state of being dealing with that kind of worldview and who you are through that worldview and the actions that you undertake in reality, then inspire people to follow you, or they'll go, no, I mean, this guy doesn't seem like he can actually digest his own kind of paradigm and manage to live in a way that inspires others. So, and that's also really, really important. Like, some people are just not ready to digest certain worldviews. Like, some people in the 15th century, if they had transitioned to empiricism or a materialist worldview, they would have started killing everyone, because they're like, oh, there's no hell, we can do whatever we want. Oh, okay, there's no punishment, there's no God. Woohoo! Rape fest and killing fest, and why should I, refrain myself from all these impulses and whatever. So, again, really strategic. It's not something that you're like, oh, we all have to switch to the same paradigm. No. It's more about, first of all, can you handle the switch from materialism to something else without going crazy? And that's really important. And I mean, myself, it took me a while to sort of settle into a worldview that is that transcends materialism, without going like, oh my God, reptilians, this, that, energies, and whatever, and woo woo, and I mean, you can really go down plenty of different rabbit holes, and if your mind is not ready, you can really, I mean, you can land. It can not. It can be pretty bad. Anyways, so that's the first point. So, when at the very end of the interview, Susan asked some very profound questions like, but why? Why does consciousness does what it does, and why does nature do what it does? And there's only a kind of vague answer in that respect. And obviously, what I don't necessarily agree with is when Bernardo describes this mind as something very instinctive and basic, just because that's his experience of it by observing nature and the laws of nature. But that's, I mean, the metaphor I'm giving is, it's like a chimpanzee looking at a quantum computer, looking at a fan that goes like this, and then a light that's blinking, and saying, okay, well, there's one thing that's constant. That fan is turning at the same speed, so that's something that's mechanic, pre-programmed. And then there's this blinking light, which I don't understand, but it's just random. In fact, that blinking light is an indicator of everything that's happening inside. It's like, when you look at a computer, when it's blinking, it's because it's thinking, it's processing, it's doing certain things in the background. But if you don't know that, if you're not smart enough to understand that, you won't see a pattern. You'll just see randomness. And so in that same way, when humans look at a galaxy, for instance, or all these kinds of other things, they see just a spinning thing, that spins at a regular pace, and they're like, okay. And then they see these, emissions of radiation or whatever that come from the black hole, like X-rays and all that stuff. And they say, okay, well, that's random. There's no pattern. Whereas inside, there may be an entire kind of universe, just like in a quantum computer. There's so many things that can go on inside, but you're just not smart enough to see it. And that's the whole idea of these dimensions and stuff. Like it may appear as something that's dumb and immaterial, but in fact, it's something like super smart. And if you looked at my previous video, then I have some answers as to why nature does what it does. And in short, just to watch the previous video, it does what it does because it is the only strategy for it to be what it is not. AKA, if you have on the one side everything and nothing, which is like the absolute, that is what it is. I am that I am. When God introduces himself to Moses, Exodus, then I am what I am not is what you are, what Moses was, what all of this is. We are continuously that which we are not. We are every single slice of experience that we have. We are not infinite, but we're not also nothing. We're something in between. We're something, but something ever changing, because the moment you are what you are not, that experience is swallowed up by consciousness, because what can be outside of infinity? Nothing can be outside of infinity. So the moment you experience something, it's swallowed up instantly and integrated by the absolute. And it becomes part of what it is. And so that's the experience of humans on a daily basis. Like your consciousness is plowing through all these experiences which are constantly just, I am what I am not, I am what I am not, I am what I am not. Right now, I'm not what I just was a few seconds ago. And it's being swallowed up by our consciousness and becomes memory. And memory, therefore, has basically just one kind of function. It's to make sure that you don't repeat that which you already are. So just to orient yourself in infinity and not going in circles and advancing towards experiencing a new thing that you are not, and not something that you already were, because that's now integrated in the absolute. So it is what you are, so you cannot experience it again. But again, I mean, that mechanism, go back to the previous video, it's kind of hard to explain just in a few seconds like this. Then there's this opposition to dualism. Dualism, everybody's like, oh, but there's only one mind, everything is an illusionary self, blah, blah, blah. And the opposition of dualism. But dualism is really, really important, actually. It's this idea, there's two ways to reconcile dualism with unity, with oneness. There's one way is take dualism as a coin. You have two sides to that coin. And one way of doing it is denying the existence of the coin itself and its two sides, and saying there is no coin, and then just collapse it into nothingness. That's going towards nihilism, towards nothingness, and saying it's all one. But it's all one in the sense that dualism now disappears. It doesn't exist anymore. It's like going from 2 dimensions to 0 dimensions. Like just everything just condenses back into, and that's one way of doing it. But it's a way that is, I would say, lazy, I guess, for lack of a better term. It's like devolving, kind of. It's like going back into nothingness because you can't handle infinity. You can't handle, juggling complex things in dualism. And you're like, this is too much, good and evil, inside, outside, illusionary self, so many different selves. My God, just leave me alone. Just collapse everything back into oneness, and that's it. Whereas the other one is, you can see unity with dualism balanced inside of it. And how do you do that? Well, you take that coin and now you spin it really, really fast. And if you spin it really, really fast, it becomes oneness again in the sphere. The sphere has only one side, but it has an extra dimension compared to the coin. Coin, well, I wouldn't say a coin, it's more like a disc, it's completely flat. It has 2 dimensions. Now you have 3 dimensions, but inside that sphere, if you look inside, it is made up of like an infinite number of slices of dualism, of 2 sides, a 2-sided coin. And so the idea here is to see how there is good and evil, there's evil and good, like all things kind of have this kind of yin-yang kind of relationship, and to be able to juggle with them in a seamless kind of way. And the faster you can juggle with them, the more they kind of merge, and at the same time you can see that unity encompasses the duality within it. The duality didn't disappear. So it's this idea of, like, for instance, the atomic structure, where you have normally you have forces that are supposed to like repel each other. Like, how does this atomic kind of structure even maintain its integrity? Because normally there should be these forces that are but if you arrange them in a certain way, then it becomes a sort of a unity, or a structure, a stable, harmonious structure. And that allows you to build something on top of that, and etc. into infinity. And so that's the non-lazy way to sort of go beyond dualism, is to see how there is unity, but with dualism that is kept kind of intact, rather than collapsing it back into oneness. Then there's this, it was really fascinating listening to Susan and her obsessiveness with parapsychology in the first part of her career. And she's like, oh, but I didn't get any proof, and I'm so disappointed. And they were talking about like Rupert Sheldrake and many of these researchers that are in parapsychology. And apparently she was probably disappointed, and like maybe they were, she didn't really mention because they didn't have the time, but maybe like the protocols were wrong, or they did some kind of false studies or whatever. And what's ironic is that they're using an old methodology, which is empiricism, to assess a new paradigm. And to me, that's like using the Bible as a reference book or a methodology to do science. Like, imagine, instead of setting up your experiment in a certain way and whatever, with the laws of like falsibility, reproducibility, all this stuff, you just pray. You pray to God that the experiment, is successful, and then you'd write down, okay, so this is how I prayed. This is what I said for the experiment to work. This is the kind of prayer I made to God, but the experiment failed. So maybe it's because, I didn't use the right words when I was praying. I mean, no. That's not how it works. When you transition to a new paradigm, you understand that that's not how things work. And I did a video on fishy science that you can watch back a little back to explicit why science is just one way to interact with reality. But the example I always give is the cells in your own in your own body. Like, if the cell at the tip of my finger was talking to cells, here, like on my keyboard or something, unicellular organisms, and it was saying, I have the power to lift a glass of water. And then the unicellular organisms reply, I don't believe you, prove it. Well, the cell at the tip of your finger will say, well, I can't, because I can do it, but it's a collective effort and I don't decide when it happens. I know, like the consciousness that is at the commands of this body decides when it happens. So it's not something that can be replicated. You as a human are not going to reproduce this experience every time so that these single-celled organisms are satisfied and have the proof that you exist. There are just certain things in the universe that aren't replicable, but that do happen from time to time for reasons that are beyond your understanding as a human, because they're not mechanical. They're not linked to a cause and effect that is based on, materialism moving from nothingness towards your reality, but from infinity going down. And there you don't understand, because it's this idea of, interdependent origination, and where there isn't this linear cause and effect kind of relationship. Just like, you can't explain empirically, like if you were a scientist that were in the shoes of a unicellular organism in a puddle, and you tried to understand why sometimes it would fluctuate and other times not, there's just no way that you could understand that there are these advanced beings that have their own kind of free will, and that sometimes they just walk into the puddle and that creates all the fluctuations and then it's gone, It does have a meaning, but at a level of reality that is way beyond what you can understand from your level of reality. So then there was this really interesting thought experiment that I wanted to talk about, which is the brain in a vat experience. So imagine you have your brain. You have this, when you close your eyes, you have this impression inside of you of consciousness, and then when you meditate, for instance, you have these meditative states where you achieve all kinds of, experiences of being this pure consciousness. But imagine if now you cut your brain off from every single stimuli of your 5 senses. You wouldn't have the sense of touch, nor smell, nor hearing, nor taste, nor sight. None of them. What would you experience? And what you would experience is probably the state of the original consciousness. And when it first came into like the very origin of consciousness. That is, it doesn't know what kind of state it's supposed to be in, because it doesn't have any kind of external stimuli to tell it this is what your new state should be. And so probably what would happen is that you would hallucinate a kind of reason outside of yourself, which is virtual, which is an illusion, just so you would have a reason to be in one state of being as opposed to another. Because otherwise you're just all states and no state. You have no idea what you're supposed to feel. Like, understand that if you cut off all senses completely, you wouldn't even know that you're a brain. We know that we have a brain because we have all the other senses, and the brain takes the form that all of those senses combined give it. But without any senses whatsoever, what kind of form would our brain actually have? We have no idea. We have no clue. Because the form that it takes is dependent on the kind of interface that's built from those 5 senses, which just create a model of reality, as Bernardo Kastrup clearly explains. That is just like dials on a board, and your brain is the form that it takes is just dials on a board. It's not the actual reality. And so, so the idea is that our 5 senses are only there for that reason. It's just a way for consciousness to, as I was saying in my previous video, that the external reality is just a way to update, or an interface to update your internal states. That's kind of the idea. Yeah, and so, thinking about things as being illusions, or everything is mind and all that stuff, it's all nice and well, but ultimately, if you go outside of the illusion or into what the real state of mind is, it's all states and no states simultaneously. And so this reality is the most sophisticated and interesting one to be in, the relative, not the absolute. Because it's fascinating how these five senses that we have evolved in order to have such a sophisticated way to manipulate your inner state of being in a very, very granular and specific and detailed kind of way. It's like we are a kind of symphony of being, and we have this interface to selectively add this or that notes to our symphony, and feeling what that feels like. Oh, now I've added, a C major here, a chord to my symphony. Ooh, that sounds interesting. Or, oh, that sounds really bad. It's amazing. Whereas this brain in a vat kind of state, it's everything and nothing. There's no direction to it. There's no meaning to it. There's no one way of modulating its state of existence or being rather than another. So rather than trying to break away from the illusion, it's actually really much more interesting to kind of go with it, actually, and saying, oh, what a wonderful illusion, and let me build on that, actually. Kind of like saying, instead of saying, realizing that all symphonies are just an illusion, saying, well, you know what, I'm going to make an even more beautiful symphony next time. So that's the whole idea. Now, there's something else that Bernardo was talking about, this idea of the dissociative boundaries inside the mind, which is, us. Like, I'm a dissociated self and Bernardo is a dissociated self, even though we're an illusionary ones. I cannot read his mind, he cannot read mine. But what is ironic in there is that you cannot have a dissociative boundary, inner boundary, if you don't have an outer boundary first. But how does mind acquire an outer boundary in the first place? And if you've listened to my previous video, 148, I explain how that happens, when, consciousness meets itself. But Bernardo doesn't really, explain how you can end up chopping your mind into these tiny, discrete kind of illusionary selves if you don't have an outer boundary to begin with. If there's no outer boundary, you cannot have inner boundaries. You cannot separate something that is inside of you if there is no outer boundary, because then there's nothing inside and there's nothing outside. There's just, it's beyond those two concepts of inside, outside. There isn't those things. So you first need to make sure, how do you acquire this outer boundary first? So, of course, gave the answer in the last video, but I just want to point out that is something that is not addressed. And finally, there was this talk about like metacognition and the fact of manipulating your own ideas and thinking about ideas in the head and manipulating that. And sometimes I find that we only see things in a certain order, and it would be good to reverse the order just to get accustomed to juggle with things that go from nothingness towards infinity, which is what we're used to in this kind of linear time space experience, and things going from infinity down towards nothingness. And there, most people, it blows their minds, it's too complex. So imagine for a moment that democracy as an idea came first, that it's actually something that exists. It's like there's an infinite number of ideas that exist there, and then in there, you can break them down into different parts, and democracy is one of those parts. So democracy is like a living concept or a being in its own right. And then it wondered, well, wait a minute, but I wonder what the components of democracy are. And so it zooms into democracy. And there it finds little humans inside democracy, as its cells, kind of, And so that's an interesting way to think about it, rather than thinking that it all kind of emerges from the ground up, because we humans, we look into the microscope and we stare into things from our perspective going downwards, breaking things down into parts, like zooming into our own bodies, or, big complex organisms like a dog, and then we zoom into it and we say, oh yeah, but there's all these parts, all these cells, blah, blah, blah. Then we zoom into those cells and we see, molecules and all this stuff. But imagine that it's in that kind of fashion but going from the infinite towards us. That means there's like some kind of being or consciousness that wants to observe what certain egregores or living kind of thought forms are made up of. And then as it zooms, it sees humans. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. So they are actually the functioning parts of an idea or a concept. Right. And so that reverses completely the order of things. And you can also juggle with this. And of course, it's both. Obviously, it's the process goes both ways. It's again, it's like a two-way process where we're both the product of going from nothingness towards infinity and something that is descending from infinity towards us, and then kind of a mix, which is also a duality in which you cannot just say no, it's unity. It is unity in the absolute, but in that sense, as Bernardo would point out, it is useless. That is, in the state of the absolute, nothing and everything are one and the same. But then, what can you do with that? Nothing. It leads you to nowhere. It doesn't give you any conclusions as to what to do next, or where to go, or what to do on that basis. And so yeah, I mean, we can both describe a human as being this evolutionary kind of evolutionary mutant chimpanzee, if you will, but also as a fallen god. It's kind of like an absolute kind of idea or concept that's been compressed and this fall from heaven kind of story where we are a fallen god. We're both. Like a consciousness that compresses itself, or an idea that compresses itself in order to sort of give itself the illusion that it is only a human when it's actually much more than that. So I think that's it for this comment on the videos, on the debate between Bernardo and Susan. Hope you found it interesting. Don't forget to send me some videos to comment on if you have any. I'd gladly watch them and give my feedback, because sometimes I just don't have any more things to talk about, and maybe you guys would like me to talk about something in particular. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe as usual, and talk to you in the next video. Bye.